All right. From crowdsourced insights to solar for the crowd. Welcome to our session on community solar. And I was really looking forward to this discussion because this is one of the most curious areas of the solar business to me, because community solar is simultaneously held up as a way to bring solar to the masses, as a way to bring solar to the majority of Americans like rooftop solar cannot, and a way to get utilities on board with solar by giving them a new offering for their customers that can get them excited, strengthen the utility-customer relationship, and get them on board with PV development. So this sector is, but it's also simultaneously one of the hardest areas of the business to scale. So the sector is considered pretty hot in the US right now. We are seeing pretty strong portfolios of projects. Projects are actually getting built. There are programs being developed around the country. Utilities seem to have a legitimate interest in community solar. But when you actually dig down on the project level, these are largely one-off projects. They're very complex in terms of how long it takes to close the transaction, develop the platform for the billing process to interface between the utility and the customer. And GTM Research earlier this year forecast that we'd see about 115 megawatts of community solar development in the US this year. And because of the complexity and some of the project delays we've seen, we might actually see a 50% cut in those numbers by the close of this year. So we brought together some of the leading community solar developers to talk about how they put together those transactions, what utilities are saying about community solar, where the most difficult areas are, and where the areas to scale are. So joining us are Karin Gados, who is the Director of Business Development and Communications at SunShare, Bart Rupert, who is the Chief Management Officer of Clean Energy Collective, and in the middle is Hugh Scott, the Chief Operating Officer of NRG Home Solar. Let's start by talking about what you all are actually doing. Bart, I want to start with you because I think you have the biggest portfolio at this point. You guys have about 100 projects, is that correct?
Yeah, we've got over 100 projects.
Those are actually developed
or that are in development.
In development.
So that are already locked in that, like you said, I mean, with some of the delays that are out there, that we're working on getting in the ground, and the over 100 projects represents a little over 130 megawatts.
Okay. What states are you operating in?
We're currently operating in about a dozen states. So you would ask me that, let me think. So if I go west to east, then we'd look at Washington State, New Mexico, Colorado, which is our home territory. Let's see, Kansas, Wyoming, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Texas, Vermont, and Massachusetts. May have missed one, but I think that's right.
So when people hear community solar, they largely think of Massachusetts, Minnesota, Colorado, and sometimes California. It sounds like you're starting to close projects in states without any legislated program.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's address that for a second. When most folks today think of community solar, largely they do think of the different legislative states that are out there. What we found by and large is that although that's true, and you see a really big land grab going after those opportunities for folks that are saying, all right, well now there's a queue, what we're finding is that that's not the case with community solar as a whole. There's utilities and developers alike that are out there saying, I want to get in on this trend. I really want to find a way to be able to embrace this change in technology or this new trend that's coming up and find a way for a variety of reasons that aren't legislatively driven to bring this technology to the forefront. So we're actually building a great part of our business on working directly with the utilities and the developers, EPCs, et cetera, to stand up these programs outside of legislation. There's a very significant demand for it. In fact, just on one of the slides in the prior session, I had seen that, of the different disruptive technologies that are out there, I guess 20% plus of the room think that's going to be the next big thing. Well, of that 20%, that's not just going to be legislative states. You're going to see a lot of community solar being built either as one-off projects or independent initiatives and what have you.
Karin, over to you. What states are you operating in, and how big is your portfolio of both completed projects, and then what does your pipeline look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So We are operating primarily in Colorado and Minnesota right now, and primarily within those states that have enacted legislation, because we feel that those markets are a lot more scalable than the individual utility markets. We have about 10, 12 megawatts built in the ground and about another 150 megawatts that are moving through the pipeline.
Would you actually consider going outside states that don't have a mandated program at some point? You're making a specific decision to only stay in states where you have a very clear target.
Yeah, I would, but I guess for our business, we are primarily interested in looking at markets with scale, that we can look 3 to 5 years down the timeline and see a scalable program that could allow us to hire staff and go into a market. So to date, those markets have been ones with enacted legislation because there is that at least 2 to 3 year timeline. Often these programs, like even in California, it's a 600 megawatt pilot program. And so these are markets that we see a lot of potential. I do get contacted by individual utilities in various states, usually munis and co-ops, that are interested in smaller one-off projects. And if we have enough bandwidth, we'll consider them, but there is a certain threshold for us before we'll really consider it.
Yeah. And Hugh, NRG recently announced a 1 megawatt project in Massachusetts, right? And you've actually worked with SunShare on partnering with projects, correct?
Yeah. I think so first of all, to answer your original question, what markets we participate in, we're in Massachusetts, we're in Minnesota, and we're now in New York. For us, I think the thing that's probably most important is really the ability to scale in those markets. And what we bring is, we bring experience from a rooftop business. And I think what we've seen that really drives adoption and scale is the ability to offer, consumers savings. There's always going to be people that are interested in participating in, community solar projects for other reasons, but fundamentally you have to be able to offer them an economic proposition that's attractive in order to be able to drive and scale this business.
So what do you actually have in the works now beyond that project in Massachusetts? Because given NRG's scope, what they've said over the years about the importance of solar, your portfolio's, it's a 1 megawatt portfolio basically. Where are you branching out? And what are your plans over the next couple of years?
I'm not really in a position to share numbers, but we have a significant pipeline of projects in all 3 of those states currently, with the most mature being Massachusetts, because that happens to be where we've been operating the longest. Our objective is working to fill that pipeline through customer acquisition, and so you'll see a number of projects coming on stream over the next 12, 18 months.
When you say pipeline, very often when we're talking about different sectors, it means different things to different developers. How far along are those projects? And I would just love to hear from each of you. When you actually say pipeline, how close to these projects are being developed? Or are these just like conversations with the utilities you're having? Karen, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would define our pipeline as projects that we have, if it's in the case of a developer selection process that includes an RFP, then these would be projects that we've been at least awarded. If it's a developer selection process where there's a queue, then these would be projects that we have achieved a certain level of site control. We've applied to the utilities. There's been a bit of a delay in Minnesota in going through all of those engineering studies, but the pipeline is secured on our end. So that's how I define it.
Excuse me.
But I wouldn't consider pipeline to be something that we're looking at, interested in having initial conversations with someone about.
And Hugh?
Yeah, I would say much the same thing. If you look at kind kind of the experience that the NRG brings, we have experience in developing large utility scale solar, and so we're using that experience, that know-how, and in many cases, those people to help generate a pipeline. So when we're talking about a pipeline, it's way beyond just initial conversations. We're talking about projects that we fully expect to interconnect at some point in the future.
Bart?
Yeah, I'd agree with Corinne and Hugh. Ultimately, there are groups out there, I think, not on this stage, that do go out and say, oh yeah, our pipelines that we had a conversation on Tuesday with this guy who happened to be affiliated with X utility. You really got to look at that as something that's a committed line of business, right, with a clear line of sight to construction. So when we talk about pipeline on our end, it's over 50 megawatts worth of projects that are in the ground, completed, and roughly 80 that are committed, that are on the way.
So what is the most difficult piece of developing these projects? Is it the relationship with the utility? Is it setting up the billing platform? Is it doing the initial studies? Bart, I'll start with you. What is the most difficult part of actually building these projects?
I think the answer is yes, to no matter what you come out with. It depends on what you're actually achieving for the utility. If you're in a situation where a lot of the legislative states that are out there, it's mostly about being able to, as Corinne was noting earlier, get into the queue and get into the process fast enough to be able to achieve velocity and get those projects in the ground, right? It's often just a land race at that point. If you're looking at different community solar projects that are more or less a utility coming along and saying, this is my goal for the next 3 to 5 years with solar, I'd like to do this with community solar, here are my objectives, then you're looking at really solving that problem and working backwards from there. But you run into all the same challenges with community solar that you would with typical solar development, right? You've still got to go and find the site. You've got to be able to go and do the engineering and the design. You've got to be able to get land use. That can take somewhere from 6 to 18 months, and then go and get the project constructed. Beyond that, you run into some of the challenges that make community solar unique. One of those things is the technology infrastructure, or what I'd call the technology infrastructure, behind making the program work. You've got to deal with the reconciliation of the credits to the customers, tracking all those, being able to bill those appropriately through the utility to the customers, keeping up from almost a CRM perspective all the panels and the serial numbers and the O&M tied to it and how that actually impacts the customer on the bottom line or the end of that on behalf of the utility. Beyond that, you've got to be able to make sure all that data is accurate. So as you're tracking production, you're tracking what goes to a customer, you're tracking the benefit therein, you've also got legal requirements you have to stand to, such as Sarbanes-Oxley in many cases around retention. So there's all kinds of legal issues that you get into as well around being able to offer a community solar and actually who's accountable for a program like that if it goes wrong. If you did have 2,000 customers that wanted to enter a class action lawsuit, who takes that on, right? And who's ultimately responsible for that? And then you deal with other things like sales and marketing. That's a really big one that comes up in community solar a lot. And it's often one of the most underlooked or forgotten about aspects of the program. A lot of the utilities we talk to believe that if you go and stand up a community solar system, automatically the subscriptions are going to come. It's like a build it and they will come mentality, right? The reality couldn't be further from that. What we've consistently found, even in areas where solar is really popular and people want it and there's a desire for it, is you've really got to put your weight into it in terms of doing sales and marketing. We've got an entire aspect of our business that only focuses on that because we have to do it very well. And quite frankly, if you don't have a system that's 100% sold out, then a lot of the groups we work with view that as a failed program. So you've really got to pay attention to that. And one quick example, just to speak to the importance in terms of difficulty of that aspect, there was one utility, I won't tell you who it is, but there was a group that we had talked to about 2 years ago, and they had said, yeah, from a community solar perspective, we're going to take this on and run it with it ourselves. And there's a lot of groups that do that, and that's fine. But they were one of those groups that did not view sales and marketing as important at all. They thought they'd build the system and everything would work out. That was a 250 kW system, which for us is pretty small, right? That's the kind of system that we probably won't build something that small again in the future. But they went ahead and built it, and the logic would be it'd be easy to sell out. The reason they did it was kind of what sticks out with me, because they wanted to prevent rooftop solar from going up in their territory, because they had a very aggressive net metering policy, and financially it was costing them a fortune. So they said, we want community solar instead of net metering to be able to save money. Makes sense, we hear that a lot. So then we said, all right, well, here's what we could do. They elected to do it themselves, and when they went to try and sell the program, they didn't put their backs into it. They didn't know how to do it. So you had, out of a 250 kW system, I think to this day, only 35 or so kW is actually sold out. And in the same period of time, since the first day that they offered their program, their rooftop subscriptions went from like less than 10 kW to over a megawatt. And so it had the exact opposite effect they intended. So that's one that I definitely put pretty high on the list of what's important.
Hugh, I want you to respond to that last piece. NRG, on a recent investor call, David Crane said that the NRG home solar business had spent more than they expected to on sales and marketing. And I'm wondering if that's an issue that you're facing in the community solar space. And then, but you do have an advantage in that you have the retail business. It's not just the power plant development expertise, it's the retail business that you can use for your sales and marketing channel. How challenging is it for you, and do you see higher transactional costs when it comes to sales and marketing? And is that one of the biggest challenges for you?
So, bluntly, no, it's not. I mean, I think that, when we look at our business, we see all sorts of synergies kind of across the value chain, Stephen. And I was listening to Bart talking, I realized, what we bring to the table. I mean, if you think about NRG, we're billing 3 million customers every month on the retail side. So we have experience of billing and managing those transactions on a regular basis and interfacing with utilities. We're acquiring customers all the time, so we have a deep and wide knowledge in both the solar and on the retail energy space on customer acquisition, so sales and marketing. And I would say that the fact that many of the locations that we're in on the community solar space, we're also offering rooftop. We have the ability to really kind of capture the cost synergy there, where we're selling to customers who may have wanted to go rooftop in the first place, but just weren't able to, either because of the nature of their roof, the nature of their kind of home, or the fact that they are maybe renting rather than owning. So it really kind of opens the net. And actually, what we see is we actually see a kind of a cost reducing impact from a sales and marketing standpoint by operating in sales and marketing, by operating in community solar. I think the other thing, I mentioned it before, on the development side, the fact that we have experience in solar development is something that we've really been able to leverage. So, I look at this I see 3 points that really kind of come together within NRG Home Solar's community solar business that really kind of work together to create a virtuous cycle, and that is our ability to work with customers. We have a deep experience kind of on the billing side, our ability to sell and recycle leads and customers on the home solar side in the states that we're operating in, and the kind of the deep experience we have with solar site development.
Karin, what about you? What is the most challenging piece? Looking at both the development side, the permitting side, the relationship with the utility, and the sales and marketing.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for us, if we're looking at scaling community solar as a company and as an industry, I think there's 2 primary challenges. And the first is that there's no standard community solar program at all. So when you look at a new market, it feels like starting from scratch. There's different rules about the size of the project. Are you allowed to co-locate or not? And if you are, how far do the projects have to be from each other? What about the bill credit structure? Is it a fixed monetary credit? Is it a variable monetary credit that incorporates demand charges like Colorado C&I clients? Is it a net metering kilowatt hour credit that incorporates time of use and like New York, and there's supply rates change every day? I mean, this is like just on the bill credit side. And then what is the interconnection process and what is the developer selection process? Is it an RFP? Is it a first come, first serve? Is it a lottery? I mean, there's the whole gambit there. So if we're trying to just create like a scalable business unit, there's not a lot of standardization out there in the market, and so it requires a lot of nimble, quick decision making and a lot of deep diving into individual markets. Additionally, you just have different business models out there. So we'll have utilities approach us and say, oh, we want to do a project, but we have this like specific entity that wants to own it. And so, you know, they come in with even like different business models. And so it's difficult to say like, this is how I'm going to enter into any new market that I ever go into. And these are the only components that I need because it changes with community solar. And then the second thing I would say is looking into the future. I think the biggest hurdle for the community solar companies in the larger markets is that kind of interconnection queue. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm from customers. There's a lot of growing interest from community solar developers and others that haven't traditionally been into community solar but have now jumped into the space. And so I think it's going to be a matter of working together with the utilities to open up the doors for a larger pipeline of community solar that can connect to the grid in a way that the utilities feel comfortable with it.
So to summarize what I just heard, these projects sound like a total pain in the ass to develop.
That's correct, Stephen.
So, but okay, so like one can imagine on a program level establishing some of those standards that you talked about. But say you're going to individual utilities, right? I mean, you have all these specific requirements when it comes to each individual utility's needs. And is this just an industry that is inherently going to deal with those challenges no matter what? I mean, do you foresee a world where these projects are not a pain in the ass to develop?
Well, can I? You know, I think that the one thing that's really important to keep in mind here is how popular community solars are. I mean, it's such, when you take a step back and you think about it, it's just such a no-brainer, right? In terms of hey, you know, I've got a horrible north-facing roof, but I still want to go solar. You know, I still want to save money the way that my next-door neighbor's been able to. You know, now I have a way of being able to do that. And so I think what you're going to see, so yes, there is absolutely complexity, and you know, there's the traditional back and forth with utilities. But I think what you're going to see is a massive groundswell as people become more and more educated about this particular product. And I think, you know, you're going to see it become increasingly mainstream. And I think that, you know, we were talking about, we talk about kind of some of the challenges that we have in the rooftop space. I think that it's going to be so much easier for the kind of consumers at large when they realize the opportunity they have to actually go solar and not have to have the inconvenience of having somebody, you know, come up and install solar panels on their roof. You know, that's going to be something that's easy to sell, and it's going to be something that people are going to really want to chase.
Bart, do you want to respond to that since you're developing so many projects outside of programs?
Your question I would liken to what the Department of Energy is going down the path of right now to say, how do we get solar installed for less than $1 a watt, right? I mean, that's been a Department of Energy SunShare initiative, and they've been pursuing that. So it's a lot like that. How do you make the process less painful so that we can get the results that Hugh's talking about, but we can do it in a way that actually makes it easy on everybody? And if you look at that problem space, it's actually far more broad than what the solar industry as a whole has been used to. Because if you look at just your typical solar development initiative for a utility scale project, where that project ends is literally where I would say community solar begins. Because that's the point where, okay, the array's online, now we can actually make it community solar, and that involves everything else. So the way that I think we have to look at that problem from a community solar perspective is just like you would in any other industry, look for the efficiencies. Look for where the waste is, look where the delays are, look for opportunities to improve upon that, look for ways to make it faster, make it less painful. And although I would say, I mean, working with individual utilities, because we're talking to, you know, utilities across more than 40 states right now, and in those conversations, there's not two utilities that we're talking to that have the exact same reason why they want to do community solar. Not two. They all have different variations, permutations, spins on it, different reasons they want to pull this, that, or the other lever in order to get success. But when you really ask the questions and you boil it down, you've probably got at the end of that about 6 core drivers to their business. And those core drivers, or at least within our business model, what we assess to be able to say, how do we speed that up? Because no matter what the overarching reason is, there's going to be about half a dozen things at the end of the day that really are moving that business forward. And it's a lot of the things that we typically see, like, how do I save more money, right, on the installation, what we're talking about here. Another one that actually just came up in the last session where all of you voted that, the biggest deal there around utilities is customer acquisition. I was reading the question backwards, so I may not have missed all the words, but that was the gist of it, right? And so utility scale solar doesn't give you customer acquisition. Community solar does. That's one of the appeals. It allows us to pivot the utility to be at the center of that transaction, the center of the relationship, so that when the customers are turning around and saying, I want solar, the utility can say, guess what? We've got a community solar program. Here you go. But we have to be able to do it more efficiently, more effectively, particularly from a cost basis perspective to get there. And a lot of that is going to be just taking the newness of the model and gradually whittling that down and making it more efficient, just like anything else out there across any industry. And I personally believe a lot of that's going to be a basis of technology and being able to take software and software programs in a centralized system to be able to take a lot of the things that take a lot of time and pull that in.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask, which was the question about platforms. And platforms, gosh, it's such an overused word. It's like disruption. It loses its meaning over time. But I mean, the software that you're developing to create those billing systems, for the utility to reach out to its customers, I mean, those are probably a very key component of all your areas of business. What are you doing that you think is particularly unique on the software side that will lower your transaction costs, make it easier for the transaction to take place with the customer, and allow the utility to have a cool offering to reach out to customers too? Let's start with you, Karin. Like, what kind of software are you developing, and do you have anything that you think is particularly innovative on that side?
I guess I'd say what we're focused on right now is just making it easier and easier for the customer to sign up for community solar. So what our CEO and founder David always says is, I just want an app and an I agree button. He's like, I want everybody in the US to say I agree, let's join community solar. And so I'd say at this point we're really kind of focusing our platform efforts there on creating a very easy way for customers to sign up. The markets
and so is that all managed on your end, or does it get integrated into the utility system? Because if you look at many of the energy efficiency companies out there that are selling software into the utility business, it's not an easy business to be in. So are you trying to push software sales to the utility, or are you just completely managing that on your end? When you think about the customer app, for example.
Yeah, I'd say mostly we do mostly manage it on our end, and that's just because our primary utility partners are large IOUs, and they have to date wanted to kind of keep their own billing components separate. That being said, I do think that there's tremendous innovation in the future, in the next 2 to 5 years, in starting to bridge these pieces like solar energy and demand side management, and having some kind of platform to get those pieces to coordinate together with each other and with the utility. I think that could be a game changer, and I think that there's a lot of excitement, around that area. I don't know how many of you guys in this audience were at the 51st state summit that SEPA put on in April, but I didn't hear the end of it. That was what I just kept hearing over and over, and so I think as an industry, and hopefully, together with our utility partners, we're moving that direction.
Yeah, no, and I'm hearing similar things from companies deploying software for demand-side management, energy efficiency programs on the residential sector. Like Tendril, for example, has rolled out their software platform to manage community solar programs. O-Power has hinted at this. So it seems like a lot of people are focused on this area. Hugh, what about you? What do you have that you think is particularly interesting for managing all that stuff?
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily describe software as interesting.
Yeah,
but
well, hey, a lot of people in this room would disagree with you.
But I think that in so much as it delivers value for consumers. But I think the two things that we're doing, really all about leveraging scale, Stephen. And I think the first thing is, when we look at billing and managing that customer relationship, we're looking to leverage the scale that we have already within NRG on our retail businesses. Bluntly, that's one of the things that's very attractive to us. I think the second area where we're leveraging scale is in markets where we're also offering rooftop. And so, on the sales and marketing side that we touched on earlier, we're able to leverage scale there, and we're able to, sell to customers that, that maybe wanted to go rooftop and weren't able to for whatever reason. And we now have another product, another arrow in the quiver that we're able to offer them. And so, for us, when we look at software, we look around, what we have already within NRG, and we're looking to see, what can we really exploit? Where can we leverage the scale that exists, and how can we bring value to customers?
Bart, this is a big area of focus for CEC.
Yeah, it is. Clean Energy Collective started really our business. The very first thing we did was build the software to run the business, and we actually would look at several key areas, as part of the platform we're looking at to be able to make it work. The first one is what I'd call, say, the foundational elements of the software, the things that you really can't live without. One of those is being able to work directly with the billing system for the utility, so the on-bill credits can be applied directly through the utility's business practice. So there's not a third party getting in between, let's say, the utility and their customer. So that's one of the things we see as pretty foundational. With that, we also believe that tracking the panels is very important, not from the standpoint of production, we'll get to that, but from an inventory perspective. Because community solar, you can basically think of as a product, right? To where you've got stock in a product, and each piece of stock belongs to an individual, and that individual gets a benefit. Well, tracking that is enormously complex, particularly when you look at different billing cycles, different timing for the billing, different rates that things get billed at. I'm not just talking like commercial residential, I'm tiered structure, time of use. There's all kinds of different complexity that has to go into that, and you've got to be able to make that bomb-proof. It's got to be 100% bulletproof. Because if the utility, say, took a chance and said, try to do it themselves, and they got it wrong, now they're liable for something that could be, potentially pretty damaging. So that's something we see as fairly foundational. We also would look at another leg of the stool, if you could call it that, the engagement aspect of that platform. You really need to make sure that the software tool that the utility is using there has an engagement component to reach out to the customer. And that can be a sales tool in the sense that one of the things we've rolled out is an e-commerce platform. So we can automate the sales process in the sense that here's your e-commerce portal that goes directly on the utility website that integrates entirely with a foundational backend. Now your customers can at 3 a.m. in their pajamas go out from their own computer in their own home without somebody coming out and assessing their roof and buy panels with their mouse. So that's a pretty good customer engagement tool. It draws them to the utility. Another thing that's out there that can be very helpful around software innovation is engagement from the standpoint of just power tools, right? Whether it's an app on the phone or a widget on a website, we've found those to be extraordinarily helpful. People will actually pull out their smartphone in the middle, of a church function or a PTA meeting to say, hey, check out what my utility is doing for me. And they're watching the app update the production for their panels and the savings they're getting in real time, right there in front of the other parent. And that's pretty groundbreaking. Another thing we look at is just some of the things to be able to provide from a software perspective around providing blueprints for how do I actually go and build this if I want to do it myself, and I'd like to just stand up the array. How do I actually go through the sales and marketing process? What does the O&M look like, right? How do I get that entire system integrated with the actual real-time production for the facility, and have an entire communications network internal to the software so that when the system goes down or there's an outage, an inverter fails or what have you, that's reported automatically through the system to the users so that the utility doesn't have to go out there and suffer reputational risk of having something that goes down that they didn't know about, or have to go and engage staff, which is an added cost to them, to actually have communication on the front end. So there's all kinds of things you can do there, but it's really at the end of the day about coming up with a suite of tools within a platform that can tie everything together from a CRM perspective, a foundational billing system perspective, a customer interaction engagement perspective, sales and marketing, to where the customer has that seamless, easy experience with the utility, and for the utility, it's cost effective and simple. And if you can achieve that, then you're on the path towards what we talked about earlier around cost savings, and the innovation that will lead to making this model very affordable.
We have a few minutes left. I want to open the floor up to questions if anyone has one. Yes, back here. We get a microphone to. Yeah, you can go, and then we'll get the other person back here. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. You talked a lot about the challenges that you're seeing in program design and so on. Can you talk about some of the challenges you're facing with financiers or financing partners? How comfortable are they with financing projects where you have multi-energy off-takers?
Good question. Who wants to take that one on first?
I mean, I'll take it. With our relationship that we have with financiers, we found it relatively easy to parlay that from talking about a portfolio of rooftop customers, or even at looking at portfolios of larger scale projects. We've been able to offer third-party financing and access to tax equity using vehicles very similar to the vehicles that we've used in other parts of our business.
I was going to say, I think the biggest challenge, we are seeing financiers getting comfortable with a mixture of, kind of investment grade C&I customers, municipalities, residential customers with a certain FICO score. The next innovation that I'd like to push the finance industry is to get them comfortable with creating solutions to include more of the low and middle income population into portfolios, and just get comfortable with the fact that community solar, unlike rooftop, is a recoverable asset. So, where can we stretch the boundaries? Can we accept portfolios with slightly lower FICO scores? Can we get comfortable with 10 and even 5 or 7 year contracts? Where can we start pushing the boundaries of innovation? Because what we're seeing in the research is that customers want to participate, and also customers who are kind of in that 20s and 30s age range, they're not as comfortable with those longer term contracts as the generation after that. So can we push our financing partners also to get comfortable with those shorter contracts? And I think that'll make a big difference for opening the pipeline to more and more customers.
Guys, I could barely sign a 2-year lease for my apartment.
Right? How many of us have would consider a 20-year agreement with our cell phone carrier, right? So.
Did you have anything else to add on that, Bart? Or?
No, I think they've covered it really well, except to say, if you look 5 years ago, it was really difficult to get financing for these projects because nobody understood what community solar is. There's so much momentum now, it's gotten a lot easier. And we've found that, just in the last 18 months, we've actually had the opposite effect, whereas instead of going out and begging financiers to help us get these projects going, there's now a lot of people, a wave of them coming to us. So that's getting actually less and less challenging, which creates a good environment to drive down costs because it allows us to have more negotiation power with talking about the rate.
Easier is a relative word, though.
Yeah, it's still, you got to have it, and it's hard to do. but it's gotten much easier over the years.
We had a question back.
I could just say, I mean, I think Corinne's point was a really key one, which is the assignability. And I think that as financiers get more and more comfortable, I think we're going to see any requirements around FICO and that's going to drop away as they realize how to operate that portfolio.
Yeah. I want to get this one question back here, and then I have one more question. We just have a couple minutes left.
Thank you. Is this on? Bart, you referenced working in states where community solar legislation does not exist, but unless you're working with a utility that is not a regulated utility, or perhaps in markets that are open markets, deregulated markets, I'm curious how you can get around other barriers, like the fact that the utility may have to file for a new tariff with the commission. So can you address how you can get around those other barriers to community solar when you do not have implementing legislation?
Yeah, so you mentioned deregulated territories. Just real quick, is your question more along the lines of specifically within deregulated territories, or is it in general? In general? Yeah, so it comes down to any utility that could go out and acquire an energy producing asset or purchase into a PPA can participate in this program. And that's the way you've got to engage around those territories that are not legislatively driven. And what you've got to know is that all the details that are typically encapsulated in state legislation or a tariff are not going to be there. And that may also mean that some of the tools that are available are not going to be there. For example, in Colorado, Xcel Energy will be able to go through and handle, and in Minnesota as well, the billing, right? There's aspects of the billing they want to do. You're not going to find that in areas, in vast majority of states that aren't legislatively driven. So that's part of that assessment that I talked about where no two utilities are the same, where you've got to go through and take a look at where are the challenge spaces and how do we fill those. And what we've found is that those challenges can be any number of a dozen or so things, but the vendor in almost all cases, in this case, we find ourselves having to come in and bring clean energy collective solution to the table to be able to work around those. And those could be around policy matters and getting in front of the PUC, PSC. It could be around technological matters, billing system integrations, pitching this to an executive who isn't quite seeing the vision, or even cost considerations. I mean, there's utilities right now that the problem they put on our doorstep is, I need to make money off of this. And so we're now having those conversations too.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. For 15 seconds for each of you, how worried about the ITC expiration or step down are you?
Not worried.
Why?
Community solar is a unique industry that we as a company believe is resilient to an ITC step down, because we're able to build with economies of scale, and yet the customer credit is closer to retail rates.
Hugh?
I'm an optimist, so I'm not concerned. I would echo the economies of scale comment, and I think the conversation that we had earlier this morning shows that there's going to be a groundswell movement towards retaining some sort of ITC at the end of 2016.
Bart?
Yeah, not worried at all. I mean, the utilities we're talking to right now, they recognize that community solar isn't so much about the asset itself, it's about the customer. And so this is really seen as a customer acquisition, a customer retention, and a customer relevancy tool to be able to stay relevant in terms of renewable energy in front of the customer. And the cost differences really shape out to where it's really not much of a factor at the end of the day. We can still in 2017 show tremendous cost savings around the idea of customer retention and those expenses compared to any other program.
Bart, Rupert, Hugh, Scott, Karen, Gados, thank you very much. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.